In 2008, scientists were exploring the remote Russian wilderness of the Altai Mountains when they reached Denisova Cave. Upon exploring its various chambers, they came across some amazing fossils from mammoths, rhinos, and various other extinct animals. However, although these were exciting, it was instead a small finger bone that caught their attention. They soon identified it as belonging to a young female hominin, with further examination revealing it to be between 76,200 and 51,600 years old. With both modern humans and Neanderthals known to have lived in the area at the time, the researchers had to turn to genetics to find out who it came from. Little did they know that this discovery would open up Pandora's box, with every question answered leaving many more. Because despite what the researchers thought, the finger was not from a Neanderthal or a modern human at all, but instead from a completely new species of human, which had remained under the radar this entire time. So who were these ancient people? What did they look like? And do they still live on through our DNA? As of 2025, these hominins haven't officially been described as a species, but are called Denisovans, at least for the time being. Their name, as you've probably worked out, is derived from Denisova Cave. The cave itself got its name from a hermit called Denisi, who lived in it all the way back in the 1700s. And since that original discovery, the remains of 9 distinct Denisovan individuals have been identified, with more likely waiting discovery. To work out when they lived, scientists looked at their mitochondrial DNA, and found that the oldest lived roughly 200,000 years ago, with some having lived much more recently. More interestingly than this, however, is the fact that individuals 19 and 21 share identical mitochondrial DNA. As this type is only passed on down by the mother, it doesn't always change each generation, meaning that these two individuals must have been fairly close maternal relatives. And whilst the oldest lived 200,000 years ago, all of the individuals whose genomes have been sequenced share a common ancestor that lived 29,000 years prior. However, given that all researchers had to work with were a few bone fragments and a single population's DNA, not much could be deciphered about them. But of course, the species wasn't restricted to just a single cave. In 1980, whilst visiting a cave high up on the Tibetan plateau, a Buddhist monk came across a lower jaw bone known as a mandible. Due to its possible importance, he passed it on to researchers at Lanzhou University. However, it was so strange that the geologist who examined it had no idea how to classify it, and thus it was left unexamined for decades. 30 years later, interest was placed back on the mandible, with advances in paleontology possibly allowing for its classification. Though as so much time had passed since then, it took 6 years just to figure out which cave it even came from. And then, due to the historically important status of the cave, it took 2 more years to get permits to excavate. In the meantime, experts were able to analyze the mandible, finding it to be over 160,000 years old. They also found that the composition of ancient proteins bore more than a passing resemblance to the hominins of Denisova Cave. Upon actually excavating the cave, they found various tools, along with mountains of animal bones with clear-cut marks. They also found another Denisovan bone, this time a rib fragment. Astonishingly, it dated to long after the mandible, dating to between 48 and 32,000 years ago. Bashir Karst Cave was not the last Denisovan site though, because in 2018 scientists in Laos were surprised to come across a hominin tooth, which had originally been uncovered by some local children. Found in the Cobra Cave, it came from a young child, probably a girl, though unfortunately it is too degraded to preserve any genetics. However, researchers are certain that it belongs to a Denisovan, whose teeth are as of now their most recognizable feature. Also, at between 164 and 131,000 years old, it lines up with when Denisovans lived in the area. Though thankfully the cool conditions in both Denisova and Bashir Cave protected their ancient DNA, meaning that we can actually learn quite a lot about their origin. So where did Denisovans come from? Well, to find out how closely related they were to us, we can look at the number of different bases in their mitochondrial DNA, measured out of a total of 16,500. On average, the Denisovans differ from us by about 385 bases, compared to 202 for Neanderthals, and a whopping 1,462 for chimps. Converting this into time suggests that we diverged from Denisovans between 1.3 and 779,000 years ago. The same calculation for Neanderthals would give us a date between 682 and 408,000 years ago. So based on mitochondrial DNA, Denisovans were the descendants of a much earlier migration of Homo erectus out of Africa, but their nuclear DNA gives us very different results. It shows that Denisovans and Neanderthals are much more closely related to each other than either is to us, with the two of them splitting from us 804,000 years ago, and from each other 640,000 years ago. This type of DNA is generally considered much more reliable, and it's what we'll go with today. The mismatch between them can be explained in many ways, with the most likely explanation being that they interbred with another archaic human species. For instance, if male Denisovans reproduce with females of another species, the change to the nuclear DNA would be rather insignificant. However, since mitochondrial DNA rarely changes, this kind of breeding would substantially change their perceived evolutionary position. And if things weren't already complex enough, genetic drift can also blur the truth, making it extremely difficult to determine where the Denisovans came from. With only 3 known sites, each separated by thousands of kilometers, we can't know where they lived, right? Well, thanks to genetic traces they left in modern humans, we know that they were widespread all across Asia, with their western range limit possibly reaching what is now the European part of Russia. In 2019, scientists identified 3 distinct Denisovan populations who passed on their genes to us. The first 2 were expected, one in Siberia and another in East Asia. However, the third was much more of a surprise to paleontologists. This population lived either on New Guinea or the surrounding islands. Each of these populations were incredibly distinct too, with the New Guinea population diverging from the others around 363,000 years ago, indicating that Denisovans experienced a strong degree of reproductive isolation. Interestingly, New Guinea Highlanders today have Denisovan genes which primarily affect early brain development, whilst people from the lowland have Denisovan genes that alter the immune system. For the Denisovans to have reached New Guinea in the first place, they would have had to have crossed the Wallace Line. This infamous barrier remained a large body of water during even the coldest parts of the Pleistocene, preventing Eurasian and Australian creatures from dispersing further. So how could they have crossed over the greatest barrier in nature? Well, one theory is that natural rafting swept them out to sea. However, I don't know about you, but to me, a large group of hominins simply drifting across the ocean seems rather implausible. Instead, I think that they could have just used boats. Being made of wood, they preserve extremely poorly in the archaeological record, meaning we will never know when they were first made. It is generally accepted that ancestral Oceanians crossed the line by boat, and there's no reason to assume that Denisovans couldn't either. However, others suggest that they didn't cross the Wallace Line at all. It is possible that the ancestors of Papuans bred with Denisovans in Sunderland before crossing over. Then, if all of the people in Sunderland with Denisovan admixture died out, it would make it seem as if breeding took place on New Guinea, though this is rather improbable. Now that we have figured out roughly where these events took place, the next logical step is to find out when, and this time the answers are more clear-cut. Breeding with the ancestors of modern-day Papuans occurred around 29,000 years ago, whilst breeding with the ancestors of all other Oceanians happened 45,700 years ago. Yet again, this is strong evidence of Denisovan existence in New Guinea. More interestingly though is that the latest confirmed date of 29,900 years ago makes them the most recent extinct human species. Despite what genetics offer in terms of evolution, It is difficult to work out what they look like based on only a few bones. So far, all scientists have to work with is a finger bone, 4 teeth, a mandible, a skull fragment, and a rib bone. The finger is largely indistinguishable from those of female humans, though their large molars are more similar to those of Middle Pleistocene archaic humans. The mandible also has a gap behind the molars and flattened front teeth, traits only shared by Neanderthals, backing up the close relationship which nuclear DNA had suggested. Based on studies of their genetic code, it's thought that they had a long and broad face, with a large nose and sloped forehead. Researchers have also suggested that they had wider chests and hips than us, possibly to decrease their surface area to volume ratio or increase their strength. 2 other fossil skulls found in central China are possibly Denisovans, though they aren't complete enough to say for sure. If indeed they are, they show that Denisovans had a much larger brain volume than both Neanderthals and modern humans. However, this doesn't mean that they were any more or less intelligent than us. And whilst these assertions about their anatomy can be unreliable, genetics are good at telling us about external features. Based on how certain genes affect us, researchers can quite confidently say that they had dark skin, as well as brown hair and eyes. Considering that Denisova Cave is very far from the equator, the fact that they didn't have light skin indicates that they were getting their vitamin D from somewhere else, which is why some scientists have concluded that Denisovans ate a large amount of fish. The same study also revealed that they had a gene that today helps Tibetans survive in lower oxygen environments, explaining how they were able to survive on the Tibetan plateau. As I mentioned before, the Denisovans were probably capable of making boats, which begs the question, what other tools did they make? Unfortunately, since 3 different human species all inhabited Denisova Cave at some point, we can't exactly say who made what. The only tools we know that they made are those from when only they lived there, including the oldest dated to 320,000 years ago. These earlier types were likely used for cutting, carving, engraving images, or chiseling. As time progressed, more complex artifacts like blades, ivory and deer tooth pendants, and a carefully crafted marble ring appear, although it is anyone's guess as to who made them. However, since the Denisovans were the only inhabitants of Bashir Karst Cave, we know that anything found there could have only been made by them. And whilst there is a lack of tools, the cave is full of animal bones with clear-cut marks on them. Most are what you'd expect, things like hares and woolly rhinos, but they were also eating carnivorans such as big cats, hyenas, dogs, and eagles. And whilst the cave contains the oldest fossils of hominins on the Tibetan plateau, it isn't the oldest piece of evidence, because in 1998, 5 hand and footprints were found in a fossilized hot spring. When analyzed in 2021, their data between 226 and 169,000 years old shocked paleontologists. These prints are arguably the oldest piece of artwork ever found, with similar art not appearing until around 40,000 years ago. Comparing their sizes to modern humans indicates that the footprints were made by an 8-year-old, whilst the handprints were made by a 12-year-old. The middle fingers of the handprints are noticeably larger than what would be expected for a 12-year-old human, suggesting it benefited them in some way. Earlier on in this video, I focused on how their genes were passed on to us, but they actually inherited some genes from other human species too, because it is clear that they bred with Neanderthals a lot. Those from Denisova Cave had got 17% of their genome from the local Neanderthal population. The individual known as Denisova 11 was actually a first-generation hybrid between a Neanderthal and a Denisovan. The fact that such an individual was found suggests that interbreeding was common in Denisova Cave. An additional 4% of their DNA comes from a currently unknown archaic human species. We also know that their hypothetical ancestors, Neandersovans, interbred with a super archaic human species in Europe. The evolutionary story of archaic humans is a fascinating topic, and I will certainly be making more videos about it in the future. In the meantime, consider watching this video about why the Neanderthals went extinct, and thanks for watching.